Amber Alt is going to talk about tomboys, baby Dykes, and girls who don't feel all right, how adults can help girls get to adult human female, which is what we want to do. And after that, we're going to hear from Shannon, HearShe, and then after that, we're going to hear from Exulansic, update on coverage of I Am Jazz Season 8. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And over to you, Amber.
I'm Amber Alt. I'm both a sociologist and a therapist. Joe's already introduced my talk. It's a long talk. It's got 3 parts. The first part is the history of the problem. The second part is what do we do to get to girls to adult human female from a macro perspective, and then what do we do at a micro perspective. So here goes. In 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld, a wealthy gay physician, sexologist, and human rights campaigner, established in Berlin the Institute for Sexual Science, a hybrid clinical, social, and activist space that became an internationally known gathering point for people considered by the broader European society as sexual deviants, in particular homosexual men, transvestites, and eventually transsexuals, many of whom seem to have been, by today's standards, men with autogynephilia. Hirschfeld sympathized with the feminist movement, but focused decidedly on men and male sexuality. The Institute housed an activist organization dedicated to repealing the German statute criminalizing homosexuality, paragraph 195, and became a repository for an extensive mailing list of gay men, others considered deviant, and their supporters. Hirschfeld worked at both the micro and the macro level, treating patients and trying to make German society safer for them. In 1923, Hirschfeld introduced the concept of the transsexual into the vernaculars of the new science of sexology. He used the term broadly for sex role nonconformists, for men who felt like women, and for homosexuals. Hirschfeld and other European sexologists also coined another term, inversion. The idea that people who experience same-sex attraction are born in the wrong body. In the case of women, this became men trapped in women's bodies. The Institute began to experiment in changing men into women as a treatment for homosexuality, gender incongruence, and autogynephilia, a project that assumed some exogenous hormones and surgical remodeling would allow gay men to pass as straight women. The Danish painter Einar Wegener, also known as Lily Elbe, became Hirschfeld's most famous experimental subject. Surgeons at the Institute first castrated Wegener, then indulged him in 3 more surgeries for removal of his penis, the implant of an ovary, and when that wasn't enough, in a pattern of escalating investments, sunk costs, and sexual appropriation, the implant of a uterus, following the fantasy that it would allow Elba to become pregnant at the age of 48. I open with this history because of a couple important details often missing from it. One of the physicians involved with Elba's surgeries, Irving Gorbant, was at the time of Elba's 1931 uterus implant, the director of a women's health clinic. Fancy that. And ultimately, he became a high-ranking Nazi physician running experiments at Dachau. In the current retelling of the life-changing reassignment surgery of Lily Elba, the life change being an early and tragic demise post-op, writers refer to the ovary and uterus implanted in Elba's male body as tissue, as in uterine tissue was implanted. Note the passive voice. Questions that should haunt all of us. What were the names of the women whose reproductive organs Elba received? What were the circumstances under which they were harvested? Were those women informed? Were they coerced? Were they compensated? And what does Lily Elba's receipt of literally anonymous and disembodied female organs of generation for the gratification of male fantasies of becoming female and constructing females tell us about the male gaze of early sexology? Is this the origin of the effort to reduce women to uterus havers? And as trans activists in the current era lobby to position biological males as infertile females eligible for womb transplants, and ethicists explore female whole body organ donation for the purpose of gestating while brain dead, what can we learn from the invisibility of women whose ovary somehow ended up in Lily Elba? While Hirschfeld focused on homosexuality in Berlin, British sexologist Havelock Ellis paid more attention to the female form of inversion. World War I had allowed many lesbians to serve in the armed forces and solidify a lesbian culture in which women found each other, socialized with each other, and empowered themselves to violate the social norm of dependence on men. Same-sex desire and same-sex romantic, sexual, and social life became more visible, provoking the curiosity of progressives and the outrage of conservatives. Increasingly aware that female partners were not just romantic friends, sexology began to formulate theories to explain why, given the opportunity, many women would choose as their social, sexual, and life partners other women. Some sexological theories conceptualized women's same-sex attractions as deviance resulting from arrested development. Some explained lesbianism as a sign of moral degeneration. Havelock Ellis eventually settled on the idea that same-sex attraction reflected natural human variation. He couldn't relinquish the idea of inversion, despite the obvious limitations of the narcissistic idea that lesbianism reflected a man in a woman's body situation. For example, the theory focused on women who chose masculine pursuits and female partners, but it couldn't explain the homosexuality of women who are conventional in their femininity. What could possibly explain non-inverted women's attraction to inverts? If two female inverts partnered, were they a gay male couple trapped in women's bodies? You can hear the which one is the woman and which one is the man question here, and see the heterosexual template imposed upon female, especially lesbian sexuality. Even when other sexologists, particularly in America, engaged in rigorous scientific comparisons of the bodies of lesbians with heterosexual women, they found no biological, anatomical, or otherwise physiological differences. What I'm saying here is the question of whether inversion explained anything was answered 100 years ago. In light of this, Ellis concluded that while butch, androgynous, stereotype-defying badass lesbians were shockingly normal females in our embodiment, we had come into the world with a masculine spirit. When science fails to confirm a sexist bias, go for the metaphysical explanation rather than ditch your theory. And here, a pause to tip my lesbian softball cap to Exulansic, who is mapping the current incarnation of the mystical church of trans that evolved from the idea of the invert. So continuing on, Ellis' scientifically untenable theory of masculine spirits tragically trapped in female bodies might have extinguished itself, save for the intervention of British lesbian socialite writer Radcliffe Hall. Hall was quite conservative. She was a converted Catholic and taken with spiritualism. She'd had a successful first novel before she turned her attention to her masterwork, The Well of Loneliness, which she envisioned as a story that would evoke sympathy and understanding for the plight of female inverts. To be clear, Radcliffe Hall was herself doing okay, given her station, but she liked the heterocentric ideas of the sexologists with whom she rubbed elbows. She felt inspired by the badass lesbian ambulance drivers among her friends, and she wanted to see the world be friendlier toward women. Stephen Gordon, the protagonist of The Well, is a strong, tall, smart, woman-loving invert who suffers her share of heartbreak and rejection before she finds love with Mary, who she meets, of course, in the ambulance corps. They get friendly with another couple, and when one of those women dies, the other commits the obligatory lesbian novel suicide. Stephen worries that the life is too much for Mary, and ultimately engages in what is supposed to be understood as an act of butch altruism to manipulate her normal girl partner into leaving her for a man, delivering the classic sad lesbian ending. Finally, Stephen, in a phrase anticipating trans ideology rhetoric at present, implores God, give us the right to our existence. As an aside, one wonders whether the masterminds of trans ideology used The Well as base code, but I digress. Despite its perspective that inversion is God-given, The Well isn't an empowering novel, nor a racy one. We can hear how it presages the ideas that lesbians as inverts are doomed to kill ourselves, perhaps if we don't become real men, even if the data don't and have never supported this, and how it reinforces the pseudoscience that lesbians are men stuck in women's bodies. And yet the novel, published in 1928, created a furor in England. where the British court declared it obscene because it defended unnatural practices between women. Diana Suhami in the Trials of Radcliffe Hall notes that Hall's subversion was that she dared, pay attention here, to change pronouns, to cover up lesbianism, to write "she kissed her" on the lips, where other writers concealed themselves behind allusions. She spoke out. Suhami notes that the British government determined that the book's use of accurate same-sex pronouns would blight society's morals and corrupt the young. At root, it was not Radcliffe Hall's book that was on trial, but her prosecutor's attitude toward lesbianism. We see here the perpetual outrage provoked by keeping those pronouns, women's sexual autonomy, and same-sex desire real. The novel wouldn't be published again in Britain until 1959. Across the pond, however, The Well of Loneliness became a sensation thanks to its notoriety and remained the most commonly read novel among lesbians for decades. Although it provided us a touchstone, it also underwrote the ongoing idea that women who defy sex stereotypes are men in women's bodies, and that lesbian life centers on the inevitable loss of our lovers to men, suicides, and social rejection. There were no Olivia Cruzes in The Well of Loneliness. It became a trope of lesbian novels for the following decades that there were no happy endings, no old Dykes in the garden, no Susan B. Anthony Memorial Unrest Home. Publishing believed that happy and lesbian constituted contradictions in terms until we ourselves began to found our own presses, own our own bookstores, and publish the damn books. But that comes later. On May 6th, 1933, 90 years ago this spring, Nazis invaded Hirschfeld's clinic. All of the books in Hirschfeld's extensive library were removed and burned in public. Nazis confiscated the mailing lists and patient lists and used them to round up sexual deviants, male and female, Jewish and non-Jewish. Irvin Gorbant, the women's clinic director and surgeon who supplied Elba with female parts, stayed and became the chief medical officer of the Luftwaffe and the principal investigator on perverse Nazi experiments at Dachau. Important to know this. During the post-war years, lesbian culture put down roots again. Gay male culture, also ignited by homosocial experiences of military service, evolved. With it became greater repression. In the US, laws against same-sex sexuality justified harassment of both lesbians and gay men, making us vulnerable to job loss, family loss, forced sterilization, and egregious forms of conversion therapy. In 1959, the first edition of the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual made homosexuality a mental illness, further opening the door to medical abuses against gay and lesbian people, including chemical castration, similar to the so-called gender-affirming medical care of the current era, lobotomy, various medically coordinated sexual aversion therapies, and psychotherapy designed to rewire same-sex attractions. With the emergence of a wave of progressive activism in the late 1960s, gay and lesbian activists recognized the APA's pathologizing of homosexuality as central to our medicalization and oppression. The brilliant lesbian activist Barbara Giddings, in collaboration with gay activist Frank Kameny, designed a multi-layered approach to educating the APA, challenging the APA, protesting the APA, and cleverly trolling the APA, with the goal of removing homosexuality as a DSM diagnosis. 50 years ago last spring, they staged a powerful intervention at the APA conference in Philadelphia, offering a panel session in which Dr. Anonymous, a gay psychiatrist in disguise, made the case for homosexuals and called to account the organization that had quietly looked the other way when gay psychiatrists used the annual meeting to network and offer each other support in a group they jokingly called the Gay PA. That year, the APA removed homosexuality from the DSM. So this was an incredible life-changing win for gay men and lesbians, but barely had it landed when the APA concocted a new diagnosis, gender identity disorder, both of adulthood and of childhood. In the early 1970s, in the midst of the heyday of the second wave of feminism in the United States, the free to be you and me era, the advent of Title IX, multiple wins for women and girls on multiple fronts, the APA decided that boys who play with Barbies and girls who refuse could and should be treated. It's clear from the writing at the time that psychologists knew that many gender nonconforming kids would grow up to be gay and lesbian. Now that homosexuality could not be treated per se, the idea behind gender identity disorder was to read childhood gender nonconformity as proto-homosexuality and to prevent homosexual adulthood by treating sissiness in boys and tomboyness in girls. The original treatment for gender identity disorder of adulthood was sex reassignment surgery. The treatment for children was therapy designed to force kids into behaviors that aligned with sex stereotypes. Generally speaking, intensive regressive behavioral therapies didn't prevent gay and lesbian kids from growing up to be gay and lesbian adults, though it did traumatize them. You can imagine subjecting a tomboy or baby dyke to an inpatient stay, requiring her to put on makeup every morning or learn to walk like a girl, who would do nothing for her self-acceptance. So despite no evidence that sex stereotype nonconformity responded to the regressive behavioral treatments designed as gender therapy by male psychiatrists, the gender identity diagnosis persisted. Between DSM-4 and 5, however, trans activists began to challenge the diagnosis, arguing correctly that gender nonconformity was not a disorder. Unlike Giddings and Kameny and Dr. Anonymous, however, they didn't argue that the diagnosis should be eliminated. Their dream was not to prevent medicine's interference with gender nonconforming people. Their dream was to access sex reassignment technologies without carrying a diagnosis of either a physical or mental illness. I engaged in participant observation at a trans activist protest of the APA in Chicago in 1997. At a meeting with representatives of the APA's Gay and Lesbian Caucus, I observed the activists struggling to make the case that trans people were oppressed as homosexuals had been. Unlike lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, however, the trans activists argued for medicalization. They first claimed that gender nonconformity is a medical condition like diabetes, and therefore required ongoing access to cross-sex hormones, but shouldn't be seen as an illness. Then they argued that gender nonconformity is like pregnancy, a physical condition that needs medical care, although unlike pregnancy, their medical needs were ongoing and lifelong. Then they argued that sex reassignment surgery was comparable to rhinoplasty, which is often elective, while also arguing that sex reassignment is not cosmetic and should proceed from a diagnosable condition so that US insurers will pay for it. Clearly, Barbara Giddings didn't write their pitch. If anything, the presentation demonstrated trans activists' embrace of the same medical interventions that had already been used to torture stigmatized gay and lesbian people for decades. In DSM-5, the current edition of the psychiatric nosology, GID has been replaced by gender dysphoria, but the same tired sexist stereotypes remain. And it's upon this diagnosis that child and adolescent transition now depend. Most kids who are gender questioning or gender dysphoric still see a resolution of their gender concerns in adulthood without medical treatment. But rather than acknowledge this empirical truth, the gender industry has identified a new market in children. And since 2018 in the United States, with the endorsement of the American Association of Pediatrics, has begun to use the same invasive treatments on kids formerly reserved for adults. The urgency of medicalizing children at younger and younger ages speaks to the awareness that left to their own developmental processes, most gender questioning kids will begin to feel comfortable in their native sex as they discover sexuality and deprive the gender industry of customers. There are now 100 pediatric gender clinics in the United States. Other people have worked out the math of the mind-boggling income generated by patients given lifelong medical disabilities and dependency as a result of conditions created by childhood sex-destructive interventions. Any of us who have even questioned these practices have been marginalized, re-educated, shut down, shut up, disciplined, stigmatized, defamed, deplatformed, and threatened. Last week's Let Women Speak event in New Zealand demonstrated the force with which this big money-backed misogyny responds to women attempting to shine the light of truth on it. The idea is to make an example of one of us, to terrorize the rest of us into freeing, into feeling the fear of voicing our concerns. In this industry, actors deliver punishments through two primary mechanisms of social control. One, violence and threats of violence, and two, economic sanctions and credible threats of economic sanctions. The harassment and attempted vilification, public terrorizing, and attempts to cancel J.K. Rowling, Maya Forstater, Kathleen Stock, and Kelly J. Keane provide the best known examples in recent years. It's been highly effective until New Zealand. As a result, children in the US have continued to be both indoctrinated and medicalized in greater and greater numbers, with girls proving especially vulnerable to social contagion, now outpacing boys by 4,000% in the medical numbers. So there's never been any demonstrated biological or anatomical difference between female inverts, that's us, lesbians, or gender nonconforming women, and heterosexual women, even after a century of looking. There's never been a way to change a member of our sexually dimorphic species into the other sex, despite a century of trying. And despite decades of cutting and shocking and chemically castrating same-sex attracted people, there's been no effective way of changing sexual orientation or any valid reason for trying. But rather than give up the project, psychiatry and medicine have colluded with and been co-opted by big money and very clever but truly sinister actors into suspending disbelief, suspending critical thinking, suspending scientific inquiry, and allowing themselves to become complicit in recirculating the 19th century pseudoscientific theory that a girl or woman who doesn't feel that she is the right kind of female must, in there somewhere, have a male soul that will be liberated by the destruction of her female body. That's the end of part one. So, how the hell do we get girls to adult human female, given the widespread institutional capture of medicine, education, the media, and the law? What would Barbara Giddings do? Just like the old patriarchy, the new patriarchy is already hegemonic. From the capture of women's public restrooms, the elimination of women's sports, the ubiquitous subversions of reality-based language, to laws that prevent physicians and therapists from doing anything other than affirm, 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 we'll need to work both to address the systemic challenges on the path to adult human female and to support the girls traveling that very fraught path. So at the micro level, how do we make the path visible and how do we protect it? We must recognize the capture happened not through grassroots activism, but through well-funded political lobbying and deal-making. This is why people feel so shocked and surprised to realize men are in women's prisons. Men are on women's and girls' teams and in women's and girls' bathrooms. Because the laws, policies, and deals have been made in a top-down manner. They have been rolled down rather than rolled up, as from the social justice movements with which we are familiar. Like many women around the world, I watched in horror last weekend as a terrifying, mostly male mob assaulted Kelly Jane Keane and the women assembled for a Let Women Speak event in Auckland. The dense, chaotic, roiling crowd perfectly embodied the pressures and horrors of the institutional and cultural capture we now face. The scene reproduced the persecution of women in the Inquisition, the witch hunts, Afghanistan, Iran. Education, medicine, law, the media now work in concert to strangle the category of woman and single-sex spaces we have created. Our rights to peaceably assemble, exercise freedom of speech, and not be forced to practice a belief system that subverts reality. Recognizing this, we must establish in every country political parties of women, by women, for women, with the solidarity of men who care about women. We must leverage our economic power, supporting pro-women businesses and withholding our business from as many institutions as possible who do not stand with women. We must provide education and training to policymakers, politicians, CEOs, healthcare providers, and the media on the scientific evidence that youth transition is ultimately damaging and an inappropriate treatment for the distress of girls. It is not gender-affirming care. It is sex-destructive experimentation. When those of us advocating the end of violence against women, women's right to freedom from discrimination in employment and law, etc., are accused of transphobia, we must see that accusation itself as narcissistic gaslighting and distraction, flipping the script, colonizing victimization, making the conversation about them. We must stay on point and give others, the media, politicians, physicians, therapists, and family members, accurate information and clarity about the importance of retaining or returning women's sex-based rights and single-sex spaces and services for girls and women. Being pro-woman is not inherently anti-trans. Trans ideology, including the pushback, makes it hard to discuss not only women's privacy, dignity, safety, and same-sex spaces, but also the possibility of treating gender dysphoric adults with dignity without destroying women's spaces. We must reclaim our language. I think we all know that we are female before we are born, when we are born, and throughout our lives. We're not assigned. If the inclusive language crew were serious, they would have been speaking not only of uterus havers, but also of testicle bearers and of pregnant women and trans men, rather than pregnant people. But the asymmetries make clear that inclusion is not the goal. We must return to the honest, exacting, accurate, reality-based language describing sex and sexism, reserving the category woman as adult human female. We need both radical and liberal strategies, working inside captured institutions and recreating institutions and processes outside of captured and destroyed institutions. Barbara Giddings would probably focus on the Departments of Health and Justice, the AMA, the American Association of Pediatrics, the federal government departments that have been captured, and our old nemesis, the APA. As detransitioners become more visible and their disabilities more apparent, the lawsuits will happen. Making detransitioners visible in these spaces and supporting their visibility and litigation against medical institutions and therapists who have served as gatekeepers will be vital. The American organization Wolf is leading the way in lawsuits and petitions in these areas already. And a personal call in, if you are a healthcare provider, social worker, or therapist, stop. Familiarize yourself with the reasons the Tavistock and Karolinska pediatric transition clinics were closed. Stop writing the authorization letters, prescribing experimental blockers and hormones, and seeing it as a kindness or social justice to affirm cross-sex identity. We have been made complicit. Educate your colleagues and your patients. Even if you can't speak up, you can stand your ground. Girls and young women need to be exposed to active, lively, wise women and stories of female resistance, bravery, and courage. We will need allies, straight and gay men, adult trans women, adult trans men who care about children and women, fathers, brothers, uncles, husbands, their time, their resources, their commitment. And here, a special call in to gay men. This is our AIDS crisis. Lesbians stepped up during the horrible decade prior to the effective treatment of HIV. We came out, we worked hard, and we offered you solidarity and care when you were targeted for harassment, abuse, and genocide. And we need you now. If girls and young women can't access women's culture, feminist culture, sex-based solidarity directly, help them do it through books. Save the hard copies of feminist books. Save the books on anatomy and physiology, including Our Bodies, Ourselves, and the Human Anatomy Coloring Book. This is especially important right now as libraries are going digital. Remember the burning of Hirschfeld's library and the many libraries that have been destroyed in many repressive regimes. Save the books for women. There's a reason the crafters of gender ideology have focused on breaking women's spaces, particularly lesbian spaces. There's a reason the funders of gender ideology have invested billions of dollars in co-opting gay and lesbian organizations and destroying the institutions that were ours, founded by lesbians, the presses, the bookstores, the music festivals, the coffee houses, the gathering sites. These institutions are spaces for intimate communication, for organizing, for community, for resistance among all women. When young women don't have access to them, it is much easier to convince them that these spaces never existed. And as the generation of Dykes and badass straight girls is medically modified, the vanguard of the next generation of progressives and women's rights campaigners is undermined, exhausted, mutilated, and quite literally disabled, unable to resist what's coming. As we witnessed the horrifying scenes at the Auckland Let Women Speak event last week, The path out and the way forward became clear. As the brave women and men supporting KGK did there, we must create intense, unquestionable solidarity and move forward through the dense social field an inch at a time, holding each other up. As the brilliant Helen Joyce recently said, it's gonna be house to house for a while. So as for individual girls, what is to be done? We must be the adults in the room. The distress of girls is growing. It's no wonder that girls are vulnerable to the idea they can opt out of girlhood, femininity, puberty, and womanhood. Adults can affirm the distress without affirming the conclusion that avoiding female puberty, using blockers, taking cross-sex hormones, and engaging in surgical interventions will somehow improve their quality of life. We need to work to understand girls' distress and despair and to give them the tools they need to understand the world as it is now and their power to make it a better place for themselves. Distressed girls need care and comfort and hope, models of female badassity, accurate information, and space to explore their distress, space to build skills at self-soothing and distress tolerance, keeping transition on the table as a decision for adulthood may buy her time that puberty blockers won't. Parents report 3 specific strategies are key to helping girls redirect from the transition path. 1 is getting them off of social media. 2 is providing accurate, clear, precise, scientifically correct education about sex, sexuality, and sex-destructive medicine. 3 is deepening girls' connections with family members, other safe adults, pets, and nature. I've started to use the acronym BENT to summarize an approach for getting girls to adult human female, whether in working with gender questioning girls directly or with others around us. In the BENT approach, we must be brave and bold, empathic, exacting, and educational, no nonsense, truthful, and trustworthy. Sounds a bit like being a Girl Scout, right? It's useful to think about what to do in any particular situation by framing it in the public health model of prevention, primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary prevention involves preventing medicalization before it starts. Secondary involves minimizing damage and reversing course once a girl's been started down the medical path. And tertiary prevention means helping a girl recover from the effects of intensive medicalization. Detransitioners need tertiary preventive care. And when they go public at great cost to themselves, as they have been doing, they contribute to the primary prevention process of others, for which we have been grateful. Here are some specific ideas for helping tomboys, baby dykes, and other gender distressed girls get to adult human female. Interview any medical professional or therapist involved in your child's care to find out if they personally feel committed to an affirmation-only approach and whether they are constrained by policy in their workplace, profession, or state or local ordinances from doing anything other than sex-destructive care when a child expresses questions about her sex. Educate providers on gender exploratory therapy. It really is a thing. 2, make sure any provider your child works with understands that LGBTQ is not one identity. Make sure they can articulate an understanding of lesbian sexuality and identity development. Many healthcare providers and therapists don't know the specificity of lesbian history, lesbian health issues, lesbian sexuality, lesbian identity development. In fact, some are more comfortable with starting girls down the road to transition than with talking to them about sexuality. Many girls also know their parents are still very homophobic. It can make doctors and other healthcare providers uncomfortable to talk with girls so young about sex, which is telling because many kids are put on the path to transition without having had a first love interest, a first kiss, a first consensual sexual experience. Transition medicine will destroy a girl's fertility and sexual functioning even before she's been able to explore the wonders of female sexuality, something many providers don't realize. So as you interview healthcare professionals, you also raise consciousness. Understand that providers are discouraged from asking questions. They aren't all exposed to the medical literature that Isadora Sanger presents in Born in the Right Body. They may not have been seeing the recent progressive resources provided by lesbian whistleblower Jamie Reed in the Free Press or the fantastic new documentary Affirmation Generation. Share these resources widely with healthcare professionals and beyond. Resist at all costs allowing so-called SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity data, to be recorded on medical charts. Trans activists pressured the US government into requiring any clinic that receives federal funds to have a SOGI field in their electronic medical record system. So now all do. And patients are presented with this as an inclusive initiative. Knowing that you are a lesbian does not make your doctor more knowledgeable about lesbian health. Avoid agreeing to have this information in charts. And if you are a healthcare provider, stop registering it. Remember how the Nazis used Hirschfeld's mailing list to identify sexual deviants? Having SOGI data on a person's medical record makes anyone coded in this way vulnerable to discrimination and a range of medical mistakes among the more perhaps benign possibilities. For girls who are recorded as trans males in the SOGI data, a lot can go wrong, both in daily interactions with healthcare system and in broader sense, as these data are mined for purposes for which we have not consented. 3, in many states, parents lose the right of access their children's health charts in the teenage years. This can be overridden by the child signing a release of information form, even though they are not of the age of consent. Whether a girl is still a minor or as a young adult on your health insurance, it's reasonable to require that she consent to your access to her medical chart so that soft transition or harder transition is not going on without your awareness. 4, transition will not resolve depression, social phobia, the social difficulties of being on the spectrum, eating disorders, or PTSD. Most girls considering transition will benefit from trauma-informed care, the kind of gender exploratory therapy advocated by Stella O'Malley and the folks at the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association, as well as from EMDR, which is a trauma intervention. Use accurate and descriptive language for interventions being used on girls and young women. Show any child or adolescent or young woman interested in these processes what they look like, what their long-term effects on the body are. Listen to detransitioners. If the young person is still under your influence or on your health insurance, agree to discuss transition if she does the research. Give her assignments to write reports on each element of sex-destructive care and review each of her reports with her. Ask her to write pro and con papers or speeches arguing for and against early transition. Number 6, this is painful. Defund Planned Parenthood until it stops informed consent model that allows minors to access cross-sex hormones with no serious vetting or therapy or the awareness of their parents. Support instead feminist women's health centers that refuse to do experimental treatment. 7, when you've found physicians or other healthcare providers with whom you and your daughter feel safe, double down on the science. Engage in sex affirmation therapy. Ask the doctor to run hormone panels to determine if your daughter is in any way not female. If your daughter is willing, consider a pelvic exam, the same spirit of curiosity and sex confirmation. Both of these processes promote education for your daughter about her body, about what is normal and not normal in girls and young women, and open communication between your daughter and a doctor who can hear your daughter's discomfort and even dysphoria without hitting the panic button. Remember, empathy and education are key. Normalize the truth. Puberty is uncomfortable. Periods are messy and inconvenient. Indoctrinated girls learn that hating your period means you must be a boy and that period discomfort is dysphoria. Sexual harassment sucks. By talking about the hassles, stresses, and confusion of a female body in puberty, you get to provide accurate, empathic, and supportive connection and sex affirmation. 8, teach critical thinking. Normalize calling magical thinking, and calling BS, BS. 9, teach girls to set boundaries and respond to boundary violations. Get young women into self-defense classes, martial arts, strength training, and outdoor activities. 10, surround girls with competent, sane, trustworthy adults, male and female, who will be truthful. Dads and grandfathers and uncles who support girls exploring activities and roles associated with their interests and signaling their acceptance of a girl as is can be incredibly helpful to gender nonconforming girls. 11, if you have a tomboy, help her find clothes in a style she loves that fit her well. If she can't see herself becoming a lady, find her tailored clothes cut to fit. Tailoring girls' clothes is much cheaper than remodeling a female body to fit into boys' wear. 12, provide your daughter with stories of historical badass sisters and resistors so that she can imagine herself becoming a strong, competent, brave woman. Point out examples of contemporary images of strong women. Make stories of women's collective action, solidarity, and bravery visible to her. Make lesbian history visible to her. 13, always remember that your daughter is not the problem here. She's caught up in a wider social phenomenon. She's young and she's uncomfortable, and she's trying to find ways of getting more comfortable. She needs your kindness and care and your firm, honest limit setting and the truth. 14, if you are in a toxic relationship while trying to raise a girl, please explore if you can safely exit. Watching her mother be disempowered is horrible for a girl's optimism about her future as a woman. 15, find support for yourself. Find yourself a great therapist. Talk with other adults concerned about what's happening. If you decide you need to homeschool your daughter for a while, include solid adults as part of her educational team and make sure there are a few gender critical lesbians among them. Lean into what's already been built. GenSpect, Parents with Inconvenient Truths About Trans, and WDI are all sources of support. Women's Liberation Radio Network, WLRN, is a radical feminist news source. And, of course, Standing for Women and Let Women Speak. These have demonstrated that just making a space for women to speak incites homicidal range among the TRA. Maria Keffler has written Desist, Detrans, and Detox, Getting Your Child Out of the Gender Cult. And others of us are also writing books for parents. Write your own, or start your podcast, or plan your women's and girls' country retreat. Find those women, be those women. Remember, bent, brave and bold, empathic, exacting, and educational. No nonsense, truthful and trustworthy. I've also thought about calling this approach TERF, or Terformation Therapy. Truthful, trustworthy, empathic, exacting, educational, reliable and responsive, female, focused, and feminist. But I've heard the word TERF was taken. You can decide, bent, TERF, or both. Getting as many girls as possible to adult human female in this era is going to require every one of us and many, many more. It's a difficult fight, but the high stakes make it worthwhile. Our foremothers and foresisters did not pave the way for us to enjoy the gains they made possible, only to have their granddaughters and great-granddaughters mistake destruction for liberation on the altar of transhumanism. Remember, the majority of gender nonconforming or gender questioning girls become comfortable with their bodies and identities and femaleness without medicalization. To interfere with their development for a profit-driven, century-old debunked model of inversion they have been marketed as a panacea for their distress in a deeply disordered world is a profound expression of sexist homophobia and a betrayal of our obligation to distressed girls. I'll end with a few words from the poet Judy Grahn's History of Lesbianism. The subject of lesbianism is very ordinary, she writes. It's the question of male domination that makes everybody angry. Thank you.